We were in Mark chapter 9, and we're studying about the transfiguration of Jesus. We looked at this passage in our last lesson, and we kind of talked about the facts of the transfiguration and what happened. And I want us to focus in on it this morning and talk about some of the things that we learned from it and try to, again, set it in its context here in Mark 9 and what it was meant to teach to the disciples and lessons that we learned from it also. So verse 2 of Mark 9 says, "After 6 days Jesus taketh with him Peter and James and John, and leadeth them up into a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. And his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can make them or can white them. And there appeared unto them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here. And let us make 3 tabernacles, one for thee, and one for Moses, and one for Elias. For he wist not what to say, for they were sore afraid. And there was a cloud that overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud, saying, This is my beloved Son, hear him. And suddenly, when they had looked round about, they saw no man any more, save Jesus only with themselves. And as they came down from the mountain, he charged them that they should tell no man what things they had seen, till the Son of Man were risen from the dead. And they kept that saying with themselves, questioning one with another what the rising from the dead should mean." So when we read about this event, we understand that Peter in the end of chapter 8 has made the good confession that Jesus is the Christ, he's the Son of the living God. And then after that, of course, he challenged Jesus when Jesus began to talk about his crucifixion, and he was rebuked, of course, by Jesus for doing that. But it brings up an important idea that the disciples struggled with the concept that if Jesus is the Messiah, if he's the Son of God, if he's in fact God in human flesh, how could he be killed? How can you kill God? How can you crucify deity? And so part of that struggle had to do with the fact that Jesus' nature is that he is God, yet he's talking about being put to death. And so they didn't quite understand what all that meant and what it entailed. And of course, as it says at the end there, about the rising from the dead. So they're still struggling and they're still learning, but Jesus is trying to teach them and to bring them along. And every time, they kind of take a step in the right direction and they, grasp some new concept, when you think, well, they finally, have gotten it, well, Jesus takes us another step further, and you go deeper and deeper into who he is and what his purpose is. And so they're still being led by him to that understanding and growing in their knowledge. But on this occasion, he took Peter, James, and John, the 3 closest disciples to him, up into the mountain where he was transfigured. And part of that is probably because at the end, of course, he charges them not to tell anyone. So the fewer who saw this, it would be easier to keep a secret, if you will. And this is not to be a secret forever, but just until Jesus was raised from the dead. But also because he takes 3, no doubt because, the teaching of the Old Testament scripture was that you needed 2 or 3 witnesses to establish a fact and the truth of things. And so Jesus is going to reveal his glory as truly deity, the only begotten Son of the Father, and there needed to be witnesses to that. And not just one. If Peter were the only one who saw this and tried to tell others, then people could question him and doubt him. But when it comes from Peter and from James and from John, and they were all present and they all saw the same thing, then there's credibility to what they're going to say. And of course, backed up by all the other miracles that Jesus has done and has performed. So these 3 are taken into the mountain, and Jesus was transfigured. And the word there, the Greek word is metamorpho. We get metamorphosis from it. So he was completely changed in his appearance. Not necessarily in the sense that they couldn't recognize him as Jesus, but that he went from normal human being to glowing, shining brightly as God, revealing his glory. And so that was the transfiguration or the metamorphosis that took place. And part of that also was that his clothing became not just white, but shining. The word that's used here for shining is a word that's used, if you've ever had someone, maybe their wristwatch reflects the sun and it bounces back into your eyes, and you have to squint and look away. That's what this word meant. It was used for taking a mirror and cleaning it and shining it till it was, without any blemish, and then reflecting the sunlight from that mirror. That kind of brightness is what this word refers to here. And so it's the brightness of the sun reflected purely in a clean glass. And so Jesus, when he is shining and his clothing is shining, this is, not just some kind of brightness that we might think of in an earthly sense, but it's as bright as the sun, brighter than the sun, no doubt. And so in spite of that brightness, they still knew that it was Jesus. And not only that, but they knew Moses and Elijah. And obviously, they'd never seen Moses. They didn't know what he looked like. And they'd never seen Elijah. There aren't pictures of them around to know what they looked like. But they knew who these men were. Part of that may be because they heard them talking with Jesus. Matthew's account tells us that, and Luke tells us that they were talking about Jesus' death, his decease. And so they heard the conversation. What happened on this occasion as they went up into the mountain, when you put the other accounts together, Jesus took them up there, first of all, to pray. And apparently, while he was long in praying, as he often was, the disciples fell asleep. And so they're sleeping, and Jesus is praying, and he's transfigured. So when they wake up, they see Jesus in his glory with Moses and Elijah. And that explains some of the confusion that we see with Peter and even with the others because they'd been asleep. But nevertheless, Jesus was revealing and manifesting his glory. And that's the point and the purpose ultimately of this miracle, was to show that what Peter confessed is actually true. And that means literally true. He is the Son of God. He is the Messiah, and he's the only begotten Son of God. And to see that from his miracles and his teaching is great, as they should have. And that was what Jesus was doing and trying to teach them. But to confirm it, he now reveals his glory, or his glory is revealed, so that not only do they know it from his teaching and from his miracles, but they've seen this manifestation of his glory. And part of the reason for that is because of what Jesus has begun to tell them, that he's going to be crucified. If he is the Messiah, if he is the Son of God, then how can he be killed? And if he is killed, what does that mean? Well, what Jesus shows them is that it doesn't mean anything in the grand scheme of things, because even though he's going to be killed in a physical body, the purpose of that is to pay the price for our sins. But you can't kill God. He is a spirit, right? And so Jesus, though he's going to be crucified, he's also going to be raised from the dead, because he doesn't die. He continues to live in the spirit realm, and he'll come back from that. And so it's revealing this glory to show that Peter's confession was right and true, and to show that that Jesus is who he says he is, but also to confirm the fact that there's life beyond the grave. And so not only do they see Jesus to demonstrate this by his glory, but they see Moses and they see Elijah. Now, it's fascinating to think about those two men for a couple of reasons. How did Elijah leave this world? Well, he didn't die a normal death, but he was carried to heaven in a chariot of fire, whirlwind, and the chariot of fire that came and took him. So you have a man who didn't die, but was carried from this world to the next. And then you have Moses, and Moses died a natural death. But what happened after Moses died that natural death? Who buried the body? Well, God did, right? So no man buried Moses. God took care of that himself. So God knew where the body was buried, and God was able to raise it from the grave to let Moses appear here in whatever form he appeared. But you have a man who died, as men do, yet God cared for him in his death, in the burial of his body. And you have a man who didn't die in that sense, but was translated from this world to the next. And what is Jesus about to do? Well, he's going to die, and then God's going to take care of him, and he's going to come back, and he's going to ascend. He's going to be translated from this world to the next. And so Moses and Elijah know what that's like. They've been here and they've done it. And so they're talking with Jesus about his death. Whether that's them talking to him about what they experienced, or it's him comforting them because they're seeing, the plan of the ages being carried out. What's going to happen if the Messiah is killed? Well, all the people in the Old Testament cared about that just as much as Peter and James and John did, because this was their salvation also. And so there's comfort even for those under the old law. It's something I was thinking about. I'd never really thought about it before, but have you ever thought about this story from Moses' perspective or Elijah's perspective? That here they are in eternity, in paradise or heaven, wherever they are, and all of a sudden, Jesus leaves. He leaves paradise, this place where they've been dwelling with him and in his presence, and then Jesus is not there. The second person of the Godhead leaves because he's gone to earth, to live a human life. What must that have been like for the people in glory, to realize that the second person of the Godhead is not here anymore? And then it's hard to even think about it. You say one day God says to Moses and Elijah, you're going to go see Jesus. But it's not really one day because there's no time in heaven. It's just eternity. But they get to leave glory to come back to earth and see Jesus. Well, they know him because they've been with him in eternity. And so what must it have been like for them to step into this world again in the presence of Jesus and to talk about things? It's just fascinating what that conversation must have been. And no wonder Peter is stammering and not knowing what to say with all that's going on here. But it's just a fascinating thing that these two get to, appear and to show up back on earth for the purpose of, again, talking with Jesus about his death, but also as another purpose. Just like Peter and James and John were witnesses to the transfiguration of Jesus, Moses and Elijah are witnesses to Peter and James and John that Jesus is who he said that he is. So not only do you have Jesus manifesting his glory, but now you have Moses and Elijah confirming to the apostles that this is who Jesus really is. They've been with him in eternity. They know him in his glorified state. They've seen that. And so when they show up, they're witnesses to Peter and James and John that this is true and this is real and Jesus is who he claims to be. And then Peter and James and John become witnesses of that fact to teach it and to proclaim it to others. And so you have Moses, the greatest lawgiver in the history of God's people, of course, who was so highly regarded among the Jewish people for his role in leading them from Egyptian bondage and revealing to them, God through him, revealing the law of Moses, which was the foundation, of everything, of their religion and their culture, their society, and all of that. So you have Moses at the top of the pinnacle, except maybe for Abraham. And now here he is, second to Jesus. Jesus is appearing in glory, and Moses is there bearing witness to that fact. And then you have Elijah, perhaps the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets. You think about his stand against the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel, and just all the things that he did, all the miracles that Elijah performed. And so, again, highly elevated in the minds of the Jewish people. And they represent the law and the prophets. And so the law and the prophets, the Old Testament scriptures, are bearing witness to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. And so not only do they do that in their writings, when we read the Old Testament, we see the prophecies of Jesus and how he fulfills all those, but they also did it in person in the person of Moses and in the person of Elijah to give confirmation to the identity of Jesus. And so it really is the heart of the gospel message. And, everything that Mark has written has been building up to this. Who is Jesus? Is he just one of the prophets like Jeremiah or Isaiah? Is he John the Baptist risen from the dead, as we read in our reading this morning? Is he just a good person or a good teacher, or is he something more? Well, Peter's answer is the right answer, and the transfiguration is the confirmation of that. And not only did the people in Jesus' day need to come to terms with that in their own lives, everyone had to answer that question, who is Jesus? But we have to answer the same question as well. And we have to see him for who he is and understand who he truly is in order to follow him and to be his disciples. And he's not just a good philosopher or a good teacher or someone whose advice we should take, but you can take it along with Confucius or with Buddha or any other leader of men who founded a religion or whatever. Jesus is not just a man like they were. He's so much more. He is, in fact, God in human flesh. And that gives him a position of authority. And that's ultimately what this miracle emphasizes, and part of what's being confirmed here is that because he is the Son of God, as great as Moses was, Jesus is greater. As great as Elijah was, Jesus is greater. And therefore, when Peter says, let's build 3 booths, one for Moses and Elijah and one for you, he's told, this is my beloved Son, hear him. Not Moses and Elijah, but Jesus. And so his law, the gospel, is greater than the Old Testament, the law, and the prophets. And that's, again, part of the lesson and the emphasis that's being made here. And so it becomes confirmation of the authority of Jesus. And it further confirms the fact that Jesus is going to die and be raised from the dead. And that's one of the great lessons here, that there is life beyond the grave. And we know that because there's Moses and there's Elijah. And they've been dead for hundreds and hundreds of years, but there they are, standing there in a form that can be recognized, with voices that can be understood, and their conversation reveals them to be who in fact they are. So it's meant to obviously encourage Jesus as he's about to face death and go through that process, but it's an encouragement to the apostles that his death is not defeat, and that their deaths will not be defeat either. It's the same message to us also. There's life beyond. Life continues. And again, there's evidence of this in the appearance of Moses and Elijah and the glory of Jesus. Another thing it shows us is that even though the multitude was turning away from Jesus, as we've been seeing, more and more people are rejecting his message. They don't like the kingdom he's teaching, the spiritual nature of it, and all of those things. In spite of the fact that he had this huge following and the majority of them have abandoned him, and all of those things that are happening, God was well pleased with him. So from a human perspective, it may have looked like Jesus was failing. All of his disciples are leaving, so maybe he needs to change his message to draw in the crowds and to get more people. But God says, in whom I am well pleased. Everything Jesus was doing was right and it was true, and God accepted that and was pleased with it. And so the goal wasn't numbers just for the sake of numbers. The goal was truth, and to teach the truth and to lead people to the truth and lead them by the truth to salvation. And that choice was up to them. All Jesus could do was to tell them the truth. And if we do that as Jesus did, then God will be pleased with us. And so again, it's confirmation that he's the Son of God, and it's confirmation that his message is right and it's true. So notice again in the text it says in verse number 5 that Peter answered and said to Jesus, Master, it is good for us to be here, which is kind of an understatement, obviously, to see Jesus in his glory and then to see Moses and Elijah. Yeah, it was good to be there. What an amazing thing to be able to witness. But he goes on to say, let us make 3 tabernacles. And the word for tabernacle is the word for booth or a tent. And interestingly, at the time of year that this took place, it was right around the time and maybe even during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. And so what you did during that feast was people would go up to the roof of their house and build a tent, a booth, and they would live in that and sleep under it for the period of the feast. And it was meant to remind them of the time of their wandering in the wilderness and how they lived in tents, yet God took care of them. They never got hungry. They never went without water. Their shoes didn't wear out. God took care of them when they dwelled in tents, and they were to remember that and to honor him for it. And so Peter is probably thinking about the Feast of Tabernacles, and he says, Moses and Elijah are here. Let's build a booth for each of them and one for Jesus. So we can keep the Feast of Tabernacles, have these 2 men here, and what a great day that'll be. There's another thing going on here also, and that is the prophecy of Malachi. And we remember that Malachi had prophesied that Elijah would come before the Messiah came. And that prophecy was one that had confused, apparently, a lot of people. In fact, in our scripture reading this morning in Luke chapter 9, I'm going to go back over and read this. But you notice what Herod said concerning John the Baptist. It says in verse 7 that Herod the Tetrarch heard of all that was done by him, by Jesus, and he was perplexed because that it was said of some that John was risen from the dead. And notice that, first of all, that this idea of being raised from the dead, someone risen from the dead, had gotten into their thinking and into their understanding that something about the Messiah had to do with a resurrection from the dead. But they didn't quite understand it, and so it gets misapplied in all these different ways, that it was John the Baptist who would be raised from the dead, because he was a man and you could kill him, and for him to come back, what an amazing thing that would be. They didn't quite understand how it could apply to Jesus if he's God, if he's deity. So that they twist that idea of resurrection, and it gets applied in all these different ways. And we need to understand from that the same thing still happens today with Bible doctrines when people don't understand some aspect of what the Bible teaches. So you think about the second coming of Jesus and the coming of judgment and the things that the Bible teaches about that, and how people, for whatever reason, don't quite understand it, and so they create these ideas like the rapture that the Bible doesn't talk about in the way that the religious world does, but they create this idea and it takes root, and someone says, well, that makes sense to me, and then they start to spread it, and someone else starts to change it a little bit and tweak the ideas, and you get all these different doctrines, but it comes from that one root of a misunderstanding of what the Bible's actually talking about. Well, they did that with resurrection of the dead. They also did it with Elijah. Verse 8 says, and of some that Elijah had appeared, and of others that one of the old prophets was risen again. And Herod said, John have I beheaded, but who is this of whom I hear such things? And he desired to see him. So he knew that he'd killed John, but has John been raised from the dead? Or is it like others said, is this Elijah? There was this prophecy that Elijah would come before the Messiah. So is Jesus, in fact, Elijah raised from the dead? Well, that's not what God had said would happen, but they didn't understand the prophecy, so men gave their opinions about it, and their opinions get into the way of thinking of other people. Somebody teaches it to someone, and it's taught to someone else. So this notion developed that Elijah was going to be raised from the dead before the Messiah came. Well, if you don't want Jesus to be your Messiah, what better thing to do than to say, well, he's Elijah doing all the miracles, before Messiah comes. And so you can still kind of give credit to Jesus for the good things he's doing, but you don't have to accept him as the Messiah. Well, that appealed to a lot of people. So they said that Jesus was Elijah, raised from the dead. But that's not who he was. And of course, he's proven that. And what happens here on the Mount of Transfiguration is that Elijah shows up, and not raised from the dead in the sense that he's come back to live on earth and never die again or anything like that. But he's appearing in this form as confirmation, again, that Jesus is the Son of God. But even the disciples were confused about that. If you look down at verse 11 of Mark 9, it says, they asked him, saying, why say the scribes that Elijah must first come? And he answered and told them, Elijah verily cometh first, and restoreth all things, and how it is written of the Son of Man that he must suffer many things, and be set at naught. But I say unto you that Elijah is indeed come, and they have done unto him whatsoever they listed, as it is written of him. And so Jesus says, they asked, why do the scribes say that Elijah will come first? Again, that misunderstanding about Elijah literally coming back from the dead. And Jesus' answer is that Elijah does come first. But then he goes on to say that he already has come, and they did to him, whatever they wanted to, as it was written of him. And of course, he's talking about John the Baptist. In Matthew's account, Matthew 14 and the others, he specifically says that he was talking about John the Baptist. But the point is that John the Baptist came in the spirit and power of Elijah. So he was a prophet like Elijah was a prophet. And he even dressed and lived in some of the same ways that Elijah did. But his purpose was, and the point of that prophecy was that there would be a forerunner to prepare the way for the Messiah. And as Jesus says here, that he restoreth all things. He's bringing men back to, this is what the law of God says. This is what you're supposed to be doing, and you're not doing it. And if you want to be ready for the Messiah, you better repent, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And that's what John was doing, restoring all things, bringing people back to the law and the proper understanding of it, so they could recognize Jesus as the Messiah. But again, there was this misunderstanding that had become almost a doctrine of theirs, that Elijah was going to be literally raised from the dead. And the scribes taught it, the rabbis taught it, it was common knowledge, it was a doctrine that was taught throughout Judaism. Everybody believed it, and everybody was waiting for it, and they were absolutely wrong. And all those people in the religious world who believe in the rapture and are waiting for it and expecting it are absolutely wrong. I got an email this past week from some denominational group that the email said that they have gotten over 1 million people, pastors and members of churches throughout this country, to spend, I think it was starting today through the end of the month of May, to spend an hour a day. And they were trying to arrange it where every hour of the day, a new group or a new individual was doing this, but they were going to pray for Israel and pray for the nation of Israel and pray for the restoration of Israel. And you think about, I don't know how true it is, the numbers or whatever, but imagine over 1 million people praying every hour of the day from today through the end of the month of May for something that God has said is never going to happen. That's what they're focused on, because they've believed a lie, a misapplication of the Bible. And they believe that the nation of Israel physically is going to be restored, and Jesus is going to come back and sit on a throne in Jerusalem and reign for 1,000 years on the earth. And it all comes from misunderstanding what the Bible says. But it's become ingrained in the minds of so many that it's just as natural as breathing. When they read the Bible and they read Bible words, what they see is that view of it. But it's not something new. It's what happened here. And so the appearance of Elijah brings up the question with the disciples, is Elijah coming back first? So why did Peter want to build 3 booths? Because they believed When Elijah comes back, he's coming back to stay. And the fact that Elijah appeared here on the mountain means that it's time for the kingdom. And Elijah's coming back, and we're about to start the war, and we're going to overthrow Rome. And so we're going to build a house for Elijah to live in and for Moses to live in. And we're going to get this thing going and start this new kingdom that has been prophesied. And what does Jesus say to them? Actually, Jesus doesn't say anything to them. What happens? This bright cloud comes in and overshadows the whole thing. And I say overshadows, it's not a shadow, but it's a cloud of light. The disciples, the apostles, are wanting to hold on to Moses and Elijah and Jesus, and they are surrounded by light, and a voice comes out of that light and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Matthew's account tells us. Hear him. Don't build a tabernacle for Moses or Elijah. They're not coming back. That's not the kind of kingdom this is. That's not the work that's going on. But God himself appeared in his glory on that mountain and spoke to those apostles and said, "Hear him." Listen to Jesus. Not Moses and Elijah, and that doesn't mean we don't read the Old Testament, but it means their law was coming to an end. The kingdom is not Moses and Elijah coming back and being a part of a physical kingdom on the earth. It's a spiritual kingdom that Jesus was establishing, and God the Father came down on that mountain to make that point to them. So you have three witnesses, Peter, James, and John, but you also have three witnesses on the other side. When Jesus appears in his glory, you have Moses and you have Elijah and you have God the Father who declared, "This is my beloved Son." There's no more credible witness than that. There's no more doubt about who Jesus is, and there should be no more doubt about God's plan for him to be crucified and raised from the dead. They still don't understand. They're asking about Elijah, but God is making it clear who Jesus is. And I want to close with one thing here about Peter. We love him for his boldness and his willingness to put his foot in his mouth. But he makes this statement about building those tabernacles. And the Bible says in verse 6, "For he wist," that word means he knew not what to say, for they were sore afraid. There's a very important lesson to learn here from Peter. If you don't know what to say, don't say anything, right? He didn't know what to say because he was afraid, but Peter's the kind of person that feels like, well, something needs to be said. Somebody needs to say something. I mean, this is an amazing event that's going on, and nobody's making a sound. Well, I'll be the one to do it. And the best thing Peter could have done is just keep his mouth closed. If you don't know what to say, you don't have to say anything. And had he done that, he wouldn't have again been reprimanded. He's already been reprimanded by Jesus. Now he's reprimanded by God the Father. But Peter is so much like us. He puts out there what he's thinking, even if it's wrong, and is willing to be corrected. But again, it's an important lesson. If you don't know what to say, he just woke up and he was terrified and all these things that he was seeing, but he had to open his mouth, and it got him into trouble again. And so when God spoke, they all fell on their faces on the ground, and when they raised back up, it was all over. It was just Jesus standing there, and he took them down, of course, from the mountain. One last thing. Jesus tells them not to tell anybody about what had happened. This is something that comes up over and over again as Jesus is teaching, and we'll talk about all the reasons why that is, except for one. One of the reasons Jesus had to tell them not to tell others is because they were constantly telling everybody what Jesus was doing. Imagine Jesus telling his disciples not to tell other people about him and what he's doing. And if he came to us today and he said, "Don't go tell anybody about what you know about me," there wouldn't be a problem, would there? Right? We have to beg people to talk to other people about Jesus. They couldn't keep their mouths shut about him. They were telling everybody to the point that when the time wasn't ready yet, Jesus had to keep them quiet about him. And we have to beg and plead and preach and stomp and guilt trip people just to get them to talk about Jesus. What a difference it is. We don't see him as they did. We don't understand him as they came to understand. We don't think we need to tell anybody about him. But there's nothing better that we could tell anyone. Not only better, but there's no greater purpose in our lives than to tell people about Jesus. And so that's what we need to be doing. Lord willing, next time we'll pick up here just a couple things at the end here and go into the next section with the casting out of this demon. And again, learn some important lessons from what Jesus is doing here. But we'll stop here, pick up there next time.